Thank you, everybody, for joining in on today's Practical Knowledge series. Really appreciate you taking your time here to tune into this great, excellent discussion. My name is Brian Chow, Program Director for BioStrategy Partners. And BioStrategy Partners is a nonprofit consortium of academic medical centers and research institutes that's really committed to helping academic technologies translate out into the marketplace. And we offer three primary programs. One, what you see here, Practical Knowledge Series today, the Germinator program where we match industry labs to academic labs. If you have any questions, the third program that we have is the Keystone Innovation Tax Credit Program. And if you have any questions regarding these three programs, please feel free to reach out to me at brian.chow@biostrategypartners.org. I'm happy to jump on a call with you to discuss more. Before I pass it over to our wonderful panelist and speaker today, I do have a few housekeeping rules. Please mute your mics when you come in and ask your questions in the chat, and I will pop up and whenever it's appropriate to ask the questions. We do have 10 minutes of questions and answering at the end. So I will ask your questions. If not, we have pre-registered questions that Art will bring up if there are no live questions. Also, I would like to take this time to thank our sponsors today for allowing us to host this Practical Knowledge series. I'd like to thank Armstrong Teasdale, CBRE, and VM Associates, and Meniscus Limited, who have a wonderful representative here today. And with that, I would like to pass it over to Art Mallette, who is the Executive Director of Global Lung Cancer at Novartis, and he has just been wonderful to work with, and I'm sure you guys will enjoy his moderating today. So with that, Art, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you very much, Brian, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you may be joining us from today. We have a very exciting panel discussion today about the best practices for building a clinical program from early stage startups. We're going to talk about a lot of hot topics related to clinical trials, and I want to begin by introducing, first of all, just briefly discussing the clinical trial development process. And I know that most of you are very familiar with the concepts of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And I just want you to understand a couple of things as we get started today. The first thing is that this process of developing a new drug, as you all know, it's a very rigorous, expensive, and multi-phase, multi-year process. It usually starts with about 5,000 to 10,000 different ideas for molecules that might possibly one day be effective drugs in humans. Out of those 5,000 to 10,000 ideas, you will probably, if you're lucky, get one new product. So when you hear about a product even making it into clinical development, it has already passed a lot of hurdles. There are multiple teams that are involved, starting with the drug discovery team that takes that idea into the laboratory and does various tests to try to see if it might possibly work in animals. And then it goes into the translational and early development teams who try to figure out if it could possibly work in humans, and the clinical development team that tries to perfect that process and ultimately take it to the health authorities. In our case, in the US, it's the FDA for approval. But the journey only begins at that point, because then the product needs to be commercialized, and we have commercial teams, payer access teams, and medical affairs teams that all get involved. So even though we talk about phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, you can see that there's as many as 11 or 12 or a dozen or so different subphases. And the last thing that I'll just mention about this traditional pathway is that you all know that traditionally phase 3 is where you submit for registration. However, in recent years, we have started to see more and more drugs utilize what's known as the accelerated approval process. And this is for indications for conditions with a high unmet medical need. And in this case, the pivotal trial could be as early as phase 2B, or even sometimes 1B, 2A. So just keeping in mind that what we're now thinking about more than phase 1, 2, and 3 is we're thinking more about proof of concept. We're thinking then about pivotal as registrational. So with that, I'd like to introduce our wonderful panel today, and I'd like to begin with Sabina. And Sabina, would you like to take a moment and just introduce yourself to our team?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Sabina Paglialunga, and I'm Director of Scientific Affairs at Celerion. I've been with the company now for 8 years, and Celerion is an early phase clinical research organization that specializes in first-in-human and clinical pharmacology studies. So we'll do a lot of ADME, drug-drug interaction. We have a cardiac core lab with real focus on healthy volunteer studies. Our sites and clinical units are located in Lincoln, Nebraska, Phoenix, as well as Belfast in Northern Ireland. And we're one of the largest CROs for early phase studies with over 650 beds across all of our clinics. As part of scientific affairs, I provide support for our clients, our business teams, as well as our operational groups, as well as work with our sponsors on drug development programming and consulting. And I'm very excited to be a part of today's panel discussion and relay the CRO perspective.
Thank you, Sabina. You know, Sabina, you're very modest. You have a very impressive background. You've done a lot of great research over the years. Can you tell us about some of what you might be working on now that's really exciting to you?
Yes, thanks for that question, Art. So my colleagues and I, we recently did a deep dive into some of the issues impacting nitrosamines and the nitrosamines in marketed medications like rifampin, which is a drug for tuberculosis. But rifampin is also used in clinical trial drug development. It can be used as a perpetrator for drug-drug interaction studies. And we looked into alternatives for this drug because of the impurity issues. And some of our work was actually recently published in the Journal of Clinical Pharmacology and Therapeutics, as well as the Journal of Pharmaceutical Sciences.
That's fantastic, Sabina. We can't wait to see how that progresses and ultimately helps improve the lives of patients. Thank you so much, Sabina. I'd like to introduce our next panelist, Thaïs McNeal. Thaïs, would you like to take a moment and introduce yourself to our audience today?
Sure. Thank you, Art, and thank you, BioStrategy partners, and good afternoon, everyone. I am honored to be a participant on this panel. I currently lead our government affairs and patient advocacy for Ocugen, Inc., which is a biotechnology company dedicated to discovery, development, and commercialization of novel gene and cell therapies that are designed to offer hope for patients, as well as advancing research in infectious diseases to support public health. As Senior Director leading our government affairs activities, I am closely aligned with our clinical development team on priorities such as securing government opportunities to help fund our research, which is critically important for small biotech companies, as well as engaging thought leaders within medical societies and patient advocacy groups who help provide insights to help inform and strengthen our knowledge, our strategy, and our commitment to patients affected by the diseases we hope to defeat. I have been with Ocugen for about 1.5 years, so excited to be with a small biotech. I bring with me to Ocugen 35 plus years of big pharma industry experience. So I am just thrilled to be able to bring the key learnings from our large pharma companies to what we're doing here within small biotech.
Thaïs, that's wonderful. Thank you. And Thaïs, in addition to the work that you're doing in your company, you've also been very active in the community, various communities, in terms of ensuring that there's representation in clinical trials. Can you talk a little bit about that effort?
Sure, and thank you, Art. And yes, that's my passion. Being in the industry for 30 plus years, I'd like to say I grew up within the industry. Our focus has always been on the patient. You'll hear a lot of terms, patient-centric, patient empowerment. And when industry says it, it's not always trusted. And over the years, we have focused our efforts on improving the health of the population. It's been at the heart of what we do. I have been honored to help lead that change within the industry, influencing and experiencing how our patient engagement has evolved. It is iterative, our interactions have changed. Patients, the public, are not passive. They are active in their healthcare pathway, and industry needed to ensure that we were aligned with what we were seeing with patients and within the communities. They're focused more on disease prevention and treatment options. So contributing to this empowerment has been the exchange of health information, improving health literacy, understanding, which is key, the dynamics of communities, of the individuals within those communities and their circumstances. We've heard of determinants of health. So how do we in industry address that? How do we engage those communities and ensure that there's alignment with the work that we're doing in collaboration with our medical societies, our key thought leaders, and community-based organizations to bring that trust within and ensure that there is a focus not just on disease and treatment of it, but prevention and equity in healthcare. And how do we get there? It does begin with clinical trials. So to help increase diverse representation of our society within the clinical trials, by building trust within the communities, it has just been a tremendous increase that we see in segments across the country where more and more diverse populations are represented in trials.
That is an important effort, Thaïs, and we're all very grateful for the work that you and your team are doing to ensure that we get that diverse representation in clinical trials to really reflect the communities that these products will ultimately serve. Thank you, Thaïs. And we're going to hear more about that effort later. But first, let's meet our third and final panelist, Laura Reilly. Laura, would you like to introduce yourself to the team today, or to the audience today, excuse me.
Thank you, Art, and thank you, BioStrategy Partners, for having me, and thank you for the audience for participating in this very important topic. I am Laura Reilly, and I am president of Meniscus Limited. We are a marketing and medical education company, so we can help you internally educate your own staff as well as external customers as well. I have been in the industry for more years than I care to count. And the majority of my career has been in oncology. And I have done everything in clinical development, literally from preclinical and animal studies, all the way through to launching drugs and post-marketing studies. So I bring with me a vast array of experience in clinical studies and how they've changed through the years and things that we still need to change for patients' sake, as well as for data collection to get the right information out and put it before the FDA.
Well, Laura, I will share with the audience that in addition to everything else, you've been one of my personal mentors, and I've learned a lot from you over the years, and partly from your incredible breadth of experience across multiple disease areas. Can you speak a little bit about some of that experience?
Sure, Art. So I'm not just oncology, although as I tell people, oncology has every other disease in it. So I had no choice but to learn other diseases as well as working on different areas. So I've done a lot of cardiovascular work. I've done a lot of work in gastrointestinal issues, as well as endocrine. So kind of a little bit of everything across many of the areas. So, and I just love to learn and do different things. So for me, it's always exciting to have another area I have to learn.
Well, thank you, Laura. And thank you, panel. We are right on schedule. So let's move into our first topic. And what we want to talk about first are some of the basics of planning clinical trials, some of the best practices and challenges that we've seen. I think one of the key considerations that comes up is in terms of the costs and the forecasting. And Thaïs, I was wondering if you could maybe talk to us a little bit about securing government funding for early phase trials. What are some of the key considerations there?
Thank you, Art. And yes, trying to secure government funding for early phases of our trials, it's challenging, particularly with small biotech companies, because those of us who are not revenue generating are investing our own funds into the research of our trials. For smaller companies, it's a high risk, high reward. It's an extreme challenge. Innovative approaches, which smaller biotechs are doing, addressing unmet medical needs, is very costly. Securing government funds for phase 1, phase 2, we engage US government agencies like the NIH, who are great at providing fund, where there's alignment. In addition to that, there's opportunity to search for grants via grants.gov, getting on the website and finding out, which entities are actually providing funding. There are, I believe, more than 26 government agencies, which include HHS, Department of Energy, and others, in addition to the National Science Foundation, which provide funding for clinical trials. BARDA, another entity within the US government, we've had the pleasure of engaging with them. And what's really challenging, as complex as our government is, so is the process to secure funding. Nothing is guaranteed. And the transparency may not be there when we learn that funds are available. How do we go about securing that fund? So if you are not keenly knowledgeable about the inner workings of the government and how to apply, it may become necessary to hire an agency, a consultant, to help you navigate that process so that you don't miss opportunities. And within academia, there are opportunities for small biotechs to partner. There are grants for academia, and that collaboration often helps strengthen our position with the US government. So the NIH has been tremendous in supporting early phase trials, but I do recommend highly exploring other opportunities. Now that we have ChatGPT, I tried to go in, Art, and see if it would come up with a host of funders. I did not have success. So I'm going to need a tutorial on how to work that. But one thing I did come across, and we'll talk about this a bit more later, which I was surprised, that among those organizations that give grants, there are some companies who have provided funding for pre-stage clinical trials. The Mary Kay Ash Foundation, I was surprised by this, awarded over 270 grants totaling more than $26 million for innovative translational cancer research projects across the US and globally for efforts and cures for cancers affecting women. So, it's not just government funding, it's looking at opportunities across industry, across businesses. And yes, we need to learn how to search ChatGPT, because I guarantee you there'll be some secrets uncovered on where the money lies. So government funding is not easy, it's challenging. I wish I could show you my whiteboard with all the submissions that we have made and all those that are pending, because dates move. And again, the transparency on the availability of funds isn't as we would like it, but the US government has been very supportive.
That's wonderful, Thaïs. So you have shared with us that there are both fee-for-service type opportunities, but also some that we can acquire for free if we are able to apply and be accepted. And thank you for those insights. And I'm sure that we will all be teaching ChatGPT what it needs to know as a voracious little child that it is now. But it will quickly develop and learn all of this, and perhaps even from our talk today. Sabina, you mentioned earlier that you're part of a that you're familiar with CROs. Can you explain to us what is a CRO and what are some of the advantages?
Yes, so a clinical research organization, some of them are full service organizations like my company, and that's where we could support with the regulatory submissions. So your pre-IND meeting with the FDA, the CRO can write your IND for you, take care of the IRB submissions, protocol writing, database building, run the clinical trial, medical monitoring, do the data analysis, CSR writing, and then submit the final application package in the NDA. So a full service CRO can kind of handle and support all aspects of a clinical trial. And one of the advantages for small biotech companies to work with a CRO is that they could do as much or as little as needed. So a lot of the work could be outsourced to the CRO in terms of the regulatory support, data management. And this is quite helpful for some companies that are virtual that don't have those areas of expertise or even bandwidth to take on some of these tasks.
That's very interesting. Sabina, are there differences between the type of support that's needed for clinical trials based on what phase they're in, 1, 2, or 3?
Yeah, so many sponsors will work with different CROs depending on what phase they're in. So in, say, early clinical program, there you want to focus really on the safety and tolerability of your drug. And early phase studies, there's some main key proofs that you want to establish, and you had gone through that in your slide. You have the proof of presence of your drug. You want to know what the pharmacokinetics are, if the drug's getting into the right tissue. Then you have the proof of mechanism, the target engagement, and biomarkers can actually really help identify that your drug is acting where it should be acting. And then the proof of concept. And here, potentially small patient panels and biomarkers can also play a role in showing that it's doing what it's supposed to do. So for an early phase CRO, the focus here is really on getting quality data fast. So that way you can have a better understanding of your drug and make better decisions for your program, these go, no-go decisions quickly. In later stage phases of the studies and of drug development, there you really focus on efficacy, safety, and then you're confirming your findings. So a late phase CRO should have a proven track record of working within that indication, access to patients, access to site networks, and investigators with these patients that you want to treat.
That's fantastic. So we've had, from Sabina and Thaïs, we've got a real good perspective on the costs and the forecasting, kind of getting funding and sort of the mechanism. But what about some of the logistical issues related to planning a clinical trial? For example, Thaïs, can you talk a little bit about the role of sponsors?
So my clinical team could do the deeper dive on the role with securing the right clinical site, one that can ramp up quickly, that can help secure patients, recruiting patients, how they're able to engage with the patients. And I know we'll be talking about the importance of nursing, but the staff is critical as well. So there are a lot of considerations to consider when identifying clinical sites. When we think about some of the logistics, you'll often see advertised companies conducting a clinical trial, and per diem or transportation or logistical costs will be taken care of. And as a sponsor, we want to ensure that our study participants, our patients are cared for. We care for their transportation, lodging, language interpretation, because as our focus is on inherited retinal degeneration, it's a rare disease. So we're not only recruiting patients domestically, but globally as well. So we have to consider language interpretation, the need for that, the local provision of local support, and whatever those patients need to ensure that their participation in the trial is not complicated by a non-medical need. So we do this in collaboration with our study sites, with our vendor, with our CRO. We work very closely with our CRO on some of these things, those that help provide a concierge, which you call that type of service. The company, you know, the lines between sponsors and engagement with patients, particularly with recruitment, it's become so blurred because specifically with rare diseases, and being with Ocugen over the past year and a half compared to my larger company prior to that, I see the differences here. In rare diseases, there are more interactions with patients, and we have to really govern ourselves accordingly. So we want to ensure that when we offer a concierge service, that the participant information is de-identified when these types of transactions are needed, that we're compliant with the HHS and the Office for Human Research Protections. However, this guidance does not always speak to the role for sponsors clearly in the clinical trial recruitment process. So we self-govern, we make certain that our institutional review board approves of any action that we will take publicly, if it's something as small as submitting an email to and working in partnership with patient advocacy groups to inform them about our clinical trials. We make certain that the language in that is clear and approved by our IRB. And any outreach and engagement, especially in the rare disease community, because we are so interconnected, that we work through our third-party organizations, particularly patient advocacy groups, who are in the trenches, and ensuring that we respect and that we don't bias the engagement of these patients. So I hope that helped.
It helps a lot, Thaïs. And I think one of the things that's really compelling is the idea that for us to be successful in our planning of a clinical trial, we need to think about not only the patient, but their caregiver, who might need, like you mentioned, concierge services, such as transportation and maybe even housing, if they live a far distance from the study site. So certainly something to keep in mind as we plan the trial. If you're planning for success, you do need to try to figure out ways to make it easier for patients to participate if they don't live down the block from the study site and they need overnight housing or transportation, and also keeping in mind that they may need a caregiver with them. So it's not just the patient you're talking about, but some plus one person to help them. But one of the most important, and you touched on it briefly, Thaïs, is the role of nurses in the planning of these clinical trials. And Laura, as a person with an esteemed background in oncology nursing, can you tell us a little bit about what the advantages are of including nurses in the planning process?
So I'm going to be a little out there when I say this, but especially as you get into clinical studies, nurses can be the reason you succeed. And I say that, yes, I'm a nurse and I was a clinical nurse, but the things I've seen both personally and as well as professionally is they need to be involved in your study. They need to know, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? What are the drawbacks? What are the things that the patients need to know? So if you're going to educate the patients, you have to educate the staff of the location you're doing it as well. And this, hopefully, there's going to be a clinical nurse involved, somebody who does studies, but you may need to educate a wider group of nurses, because the worst thing that can happen, and it happened to me, was a nurse saying, I'd never let my family do that, because they don't believe or understand the study. I actually had to turn around and teach the nurse what the study was, and changed her mind, because it literally happened to my family. So all I can tell you is you absolutely have to engage the nurses. They are the ones who are going to help you with patient engagement, patient education, as well as adherence. We don't talk a lot about that, but adherence is critical, obviously, to a clinical study. If the patient is not taking the drug, it's not going to work. So you want the nurses to reinforce some of the things that needs to happen. So it's an advantage to incorporate nurses into your clinical plan. The other thing is, as you're going further into phase 2 or phase 3 studies, you may want to consider having a nursing study added to your clinical study, so that will add or take care of any issues that nurses typically find with that particular drug. And you can learn that from your phase 1 and 2s. To actually put that in a 2 or a 3 and get those publications out there to mitigate those issues before you even get to market.
That's really incredible insight, Laura. And I recall in 2019 at the World Lung Cancer Congress in Barcelona, one of the plenary speakers was an oncology nurse, and she spoke about how patients will often, during the trial, confide various aspects of what they're experiencing to the nurse, because they spend much more time with the nurse in some cases than they do with the physician. Can you comment on that?
Yes, a lot of times patients are afraid to tell the doctor if something isn't right, because they don't want to be taken off the study, but they'll tell the nurse because they're hoping the nurse will have a solution for them. So it's really important to have that care team, the nurse as well as the physician, talking to each other about what the patients are actually saying. I mean, I used to work with my physicians hand in hand. Patients would tell me things they never tell the doctor. And yet, as a care team, we made decisions for the patient. So it's very valuable.
That's amazing, Laura. And earlier we were talking a little bit about some of the challenges that patients might face logistically. And one of the things that's emerged in recent years, especially during the pandemic, has been the rise of digital technology to help decentralize clinical trials. Sabina, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the impact of telehealth and digital tech in the most recent years.
Yeah, so the FDA actually just released guidance on decentralized clinical trials and these kind of virtual clinical trials. So this guidance just came out in May of this year. And I will say, though, that it's fairly rare to see a fully decentralized clinical trial where the participant is dosed, all of the samples are taken outside of a clinical unit, but it could be appropriate if the drug is simple to administer, has a very well characterized safety profile, and does not require any complex types of assessments. But for the most part, we're seeing a lot of hybrid type setups or models where there is a combination of some of these decentralized trial elements with some clinical site visits. So, for example, you could do, say, an e-consent or have electronic patient-reported outcomes, electronic clinical outcome assessments. And this could be done through the telehealth models. There could also be, say, at-home visits. And then there's also potential to use some of these technologies like apps on smartphones to do some of the e-pros, for example. And then there's advancements recently with digital technology. So we're getting into wearables and sensors that could provide a wealth of data and continuous data. And that has really advanced in the field. So we're seeing quite a few of these hybrid models that contain elements of decentralized trials. But I do want to mention there are still barriers and some work to be done in this realm. You need to consider that some of the participants or patients may not have access to the internet. So that could be difficult, especially if a lot of these texts require internet access. And then again, you would want the devices and e-tools to be quite user-friendly, something that, say, potentially older participants may not be too familiar with some of these newer apps and technologies, so there's some training required there. And then privacy and security are also big issues and concerns to think about when bringing in some of these electronic and digital technology. But I will say that that's where the role of the CRO can really come in and help with e-data capture systems and e-data capture management. They could identify and qualify vendors to help support these programs through setups and trainings, as well as the site monitoring, project management, and then also coordinate any home virtual trial visits or local lab visits, and handle the back-end data analysis and bioanalysis.
Sabina, it sounds like these are exciting times for technology.
Definitely.
Well, we have about 9 minutes left, and in this final segment, let's talk a little bit about fostering diversity in clinical trial participation. And diversity is a word that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. The word diversity itself is kind of diverse. But in clinical trials, when we talk about diversity, Thaïs, what are some of the aspects of diversity that we're looking at in clinical trials?
Thanks, Art. And, diversity in clinical trials, of course, racial diversity, ethnic diversity are extremely important because we need to understand how a drug will work in different people. We've learned from past experience that some medications don't work well for all populations. So having that diversity for racial and ethnic populations is key, as well as gender diversity as well. There are some drugs that work better for women, not as well in women, better for men, and so on. So increasing diversity in clinical trials is critical, not only to understanding how a drug or an asset will work in various populations, but it's also critical to ensuring health equity. In the 2020 snapshot summary report that the FDA distributed, when they looked at it, I'm going to focus just a little bit on racial diversity here because it's important. The demographic subgroups, they looked at Black, White, Asian, and Hispanic Americans. Average representation in clinical trials were 8% for Blacks, African Americans, 75% for White Americans, 6% for Asian Americans, and 11% for Hispanic Americans. Groups significantly underrepresented in clinical trials in the US population are Black and African American and Hispanic, with differences of 32% based on their composition of the US population and 42% respectively. Some of the challenges on addressing this lack of diversity, we can touch on, but it requires a deeper dive. But when we talk about the lack of trust within communities in clinical trials, particularly in communities of color, not enough education about the importance of clinical trials and the need for participation in clinical trials. There's no encouragement of conversations between healthcare providers and their patients. And then there's also that implicit bias. There's a continuation of discrimination in healthcare systemically within our health system. There's limited access to trial sites in underrepresented communities, limited diverse investigators and staff running clinical trials, limited awareness and understanding of the needs, particularly when we're thinking about rare diseases. It even complicates the sphere even more so. So I'll focus a little bit on vision loss because of the space that we're in with Ocugen. If we combine vision loss with someone who also has a comorbidity like diabetes or heart disease, we don't see them in clinical trials. And that's one thing Ocugen is going to work on as we advance our research to address retinal diseases. So ensuring that we have greater representation of our populations that are impacted by these chronic conditions and rare diseases will help advance the work that we're doing to ensure that we are developing the right medication for the right patient. So diversity in clinical trials, there's a lot of work that's being done in that space. Industry is working very, very closely with patient groups, with medical societies who are all committed to ensuring that education becomes a priority when working within the communities. Because every community, every individual is different. We know that when we think about determinants of health, we need to be able to tailor our programs to address the needs of those patients. I'll end with this. I had the chance to sit with one of our lead directors from the FDA Division of Ophthalmology, and we were discussing visual acuity test. And he shared, that of course is very important when you place a map on the floor and ask someone that has vision loss to navigate. But what we need to include in that is what is important for that patient. How can he or she navigate around tables, getting through doors? So ensuring that we have full representation of our populations that are greatly impacted by these diseases will help us have a better understanding of how we can improve our health outcomes.
Thaïs, that, like you said, this could be a whole separate discussion. As you mentioned, racial, ethnic, gender diversity. We touched a little bit upon age diversity, but Laura, there's another aspect of diversity that's severely lacking in our clinical trials. Can you describe a little bit about the performance status?
Yeah, so one of the things that we found in oncology that was lacking is performance status as part of the stratification. Because what we do is we take the healthy patients, the ones who don't have a lot of comorbid conditions, the ones who are in better shape, and consequently use them in the clinical trial. However, that's not the average patient population. The average patient population has the comorbidities, as well as a performance status that probably isn't, a 90 or better. It's probably in the 70s. So consequently, looking at what we need to do in clinical studies to include these populations, maybe this is a different stratification. They become a different cohort that we look at, and we can pull them out easily to say, okay, maybe patients who have diabetes are not the ones that should be using this drug, or patients who have bone loss need to have other things happen. So we've seen this in oncology and now in other disease entities where the FDA is asking, well, this is great in patients who are healthy, but what about the real patients who usually aren't that healthy? So it's a different way to look at diversity.
Now, a lot of times companies will say, but Laura, we don't really want to include those really unhealthy SWOG performance status 3 patients because it might prevent our product from getting approved because they are just so not well. What do you say to them?
So that's where they need to be a different stratification or a different cohort that can be moved out as you look at the entire study. So if those patients don't work or do as well in the clinical study because they're so sick, why are they getting so sick and what else can we do for it? And then for the healthier patients, gee, this looks really good, so let's look at that. If you look at the recent Alzheimer's study, it was the patients who, the drug just got approved. It was the patients who had very mild symptoms of Alzheimer's who did very well. And the ones who were progressing didn't, because they included that and they were able to extrapolate those patients that were in a worse performance status group than those who were in the better performance status group.
That's amazing. Well, we're right on time, and as Brian gathers questions from the audience, and Brian, you'll let us know when you're ready for those. Let's just talk very briefly about maybe a lightning round, maybe 30 seconds each, on some of the strategies that we might engage to involve these underrepresented populations. So Thaïs, maybe for 20, 30 seconds, can you just talk a little bit about patient advocacy?
Patient advocacy groups that are aligned with specific disease areas are critical to engage. They help shape policy, they help shape policy around healthcare, they help elevate awareness for industry, and they are a part of the community. So becoming a part of that community, working with patient advocacy organizations, community health workers, I'll add there as well, are critically important. We saw that with COVID-19, the vaccines, how they all came together and were able to elevate awareness for the need for vaccines and get people immunized, especially in those marginalized communities.
You know, and Thaïs, it's very important. You mentioned these patient advocacy organizations. I know a lot of companies have actually invited them to the table as they're actually planning their clinical trials to get their input even into the study design.
Absolutely.
So Laura, what about the overall perception of clinical trials? Thaïs touched a little bit upon the COVID-19 situation, but what would you say are some of the issues or opportunities to change the perception of clinical trials?
Well, I think the issue still exists that people think clinical trials are making them guinea pigs. And we need to do a lot for them to understand that clinical trials are a way to improve not only your health, but the health of the people coming behind you. So we need to change not only the perception of clinical trials, but patient engagement in them and their families. A patient may decide to do it and their families may say no because they didn't have that conversation with the healthcare providers. So it's really important to include whoever the family or the active participants are with the clinical trial people as well as the patient. You know, we need to ask patients to talk more about what were the benefits of being in a clinical trial. Your patients in clinical trials usually get more care than patients who are not in the clinical trial. We need to make sure that we give things in layman's terms, and we need to tell patients how they did on the study versus what the study showed. And then we also need to ask them throughout, what are we doing right and what do we need to do more of? And what have we done that you don't like? This will help us actually recruit future patients, but we need to get rid of that whole idea that they're guinea pigs.
Yeah, Laura, that's a great point. I know that in oncology, it comes up a lot. And one of the things I've heard companies and investigators explain to patients is, this isn't a last ditch effort. This isn't your last hope. This might be your best hope if you have a disease for which the standard of care does not provide a cure. And speaking of the motivations behind the different phases, you mentioned, Laura, a little bit about that. But Sabina, can you tell us from a CRO perspective, are there different motivations for patients depending on the clinical trial phase that they might be getting into?
Yeah, yes, definitely. So with, say, your first in human study, your early phase clinical trial, there may be no real potential benefit to a patient. And so their motivation to participate may be low, but that's where healthy volunteers can play an important role. Even in oncology drugs, for example, as long as the drug itself doesn't impact or have an effect on DNA, the FDA would likely approve first in human trials within healthy volunteers. And for the healthy volunteer population there, the motivation is the stipend, and then also could be altruistic motivations as well. They may have a family member that is sick, and this is their way to help. Now, the IRB or ethics committee will review the stipend remuneration and make sure that it's proportioned for the burden of the clinical research and doesn't present any undue influence on research participation. And then as we were talking about for later phases studies, then patient motivation is really receiving that novel therapy or advancing the treatments for that disease.
That's fascinating. I think it is important for us to think about the different motivations patients may have depending on the stage of their disease and the stage of the trial.
Mhm.
And Brian, we'll just check in with you to see if we have any questions from the audience yet.
Yeah, thank you. Or do have one question here. So here, a lot of these clinical trials are run with hospitals, medical centers, and perhaps some outside clinics. What are some best strategies that you have to engage these organizations to help you run your clinical trials?
I can jump in on this one and say it's really the CRO actually has a number of site networks, and they have established contacts within a lot of these hospital settings, independent researchers, investigators. So tapping into their contacts is one great way to get access to that network of sites among the various centers.
Yeah, and I'd like to add, with the sponsors, it's development of relationships with a lot of the key thought leaders with the medical institutions, particularly in the field where we're studying, who also have those connections. And some of the hospitals know that if in a rare disease we're looking for a specific gene mutation, they can say, they let us know, well, I have 20 patients that have this particular gene mutation, and there's opportunity then for us to engage and hopefully develop a relationship where we can collaborate on conducting the trial jointly or bringing their patients to another site, which is another touchy subject. But the sponsor relationships are key with key opinion leaders, thought leaders, and medical societies as well.
I'd also like to add, don't forget the advocacy groups. They are really important about helping you identify. If you don't have the relationships out there with the key opinion leaders, they can help you identify who they are and make those introductions.
That's a great point, Laura.
Thank you,
Brian, what else
everybody.
have we heard from the audience today?
So that was actually the only question that came in live today. So feel free to pick some of the pre-registration questions that you have there.
Sure. And I would say that one thing that I think a lot of companies wonder about is to what degree should we make efforts to extrapolate efficacy signals from those early trials that you talked about, Sabina. Those early phase 1, as you correctly mentioned, are usually focused more on the safety and tolerability, but you do sometimes see some early efficacy signals. What can we make of those?
Yeah, I think it's great if you can identify and measure some early signals of efficacy. This could really help with your go, no go making decisions. You know, that model and tech fail early, fail fast. So those could really help. But then also if those signals do prove to be positive, then that could help you down the line secure funding and additional partnerships and help build and support your program as you move into your later phases. You have these biomarkers already in place.
That's really interesting. I was wondering, are there specific strategies when the condition to treat is emergency?
Go ahead, Thaïs.
I'm thinking, and I don't know if this will specifically answer the question, but with emergency and Laura, I would ask you for a cancer patient, emergency use authorization, the government will provide that for companies to permit states, for example, or physicians specifically, if they have a patient that is not either eligible for a clinical trial or there's some reason logistically they cannot participate. The physician will ask the sponsor if they can use the treatment for a patient, and typically it's either a life or death situation. And Laura, I'm going to ask you to keep me correct on this.
Yes, Thaïs, that's exactly it. Those emergency indications, they're usually for patients who don't qualify. So either their performance status is too low, they didn't qualify, but there's nothing left. but you have to go through all of the steps of emergency authorization to know that that patient is not going to be included in your efficacy findings. However, their side effects are. If you give the drug, you're going to have to report on any side effects that are there. So it becomes a whole public relations nightmare when you say no, if people are very intuitive and know how to use, whether it's social media or whatever, they won't let me have it. Patients need to understand the no's especially when it's an emergency, why the no, as well as why the yes. Both sides are really important to talk about with the patient and their family, because if you don't tell them, they're going to make it up. They're going to say, oh, it's because I'm a color. It's because I'm a woman. It's because I'm too, they're going to give a reason that may not be true. So they need to understand the yeses and the nos very clearly. But those will tug at your heartstrings. Let me tell you, as someone who worked also in pediatrics, we applied for emergency access to a lot of drugs for children because children are not included in the clinical trials.
Interesting, Laura. Well, I want to thank the panel today. This has been a very riveting discussion. And Laura, as you said, a lot of these comments tug at our heartstrings. And there's so much more to discuss. I would like to give the panelists each a moment, maybe 45 seconds or so as we prepare to end this meeting, just to make a few closing remarks. And let's start with Sabina.
Thank you, Art. So I just want to reiterate that the CRO is consider it as your partner in drug development. They can handle the regulatory support. They have that clinical expertise, project management, data management, and can fill in all the gaps for small biotech companies. And then, when choosing your CRO, look for one that has the expertise, capabilities, and innovative research strategies to get your drug to market.
Thank you so much, Sabina. And Thaïs.
Thank you, Art. I think, when we talk about clinical trials, greater education and awareness of clinical trials is essential at the community and individual level. And a health system that supports and sustains a community-based infrastructure dedicated to health equity and justice in clinical trials, clinical trial diversity, providing a strong network, continuous site development, because we do not see that in underrepresented populations, continuous site development and training, standardizing the platform, data, developing strong community relationships. I really want to see our health systems get more engaged. Not to say they're not doing it, but that needs to happen. They need to become a sustainable part of that community infrastructure.
Thank you, Thaïs. And Laura.
Well, I totally agree with Thaïs. She speaks to my heart. But also, I think one of the things that we need to do going forward, whether it's a small biotech company or a major pharma company doing clinical trials, is change how people feel about participating. That it's really important that we do more education to the world about the value of clinical trials and what it does for the individual, for the society, for their community. I mean, it's very, very important. We at Meniscus, work on a lot of marketing things as well as education. And I will tell you that, and Art will reiterate this, marketing begins the moment you leave the lab. The moment you talk to somebody outside of your organization, what you say, how you say it, when you say it, and the tone in which you say it are all critical. And that has an effect on who wants to be involved in your clinical studies and in your programs. So I think this is a really engaging topic and wonderful. And I'm hoping that we can do another one and talk a little bit more on marketing.
Thank you, Laura. And another quotable from you: marketing begins the moment you leave the lab. And I would like to then turn it over to Brian and thank our panel and our audience today. And Brian, did you have a few closing remarks?
Yes, thank you, Art. And thank you again for the amazing moderator, being an amazing moderator. I'd just like to thank the panelists as well for the wonderful discussion and also everyone for tuning in today during lunchtime. We hope you learned something today about running and planning clinical trials. Additionally, I'd like to let you guys know, feel free to reach out to any of these panelists here. The email is right here. If you haven't jotted them down, feel free to also email me about brian.chow at biostrategypartner.org. I'm happy to connect you with them or talk about any of the programs that we offer. So then again, thanks again for tuning in, and we hope to see you at our next Practical Knowledge series. Thank you, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you for participating.